Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. We have some classes in the West where it's still morning for you guys. I'm happy to have everybody with us today. My name is Brent Peltola. I am the Executive Director of Partners in Research Canada, and I am pleased to have to be running this session for you today. I'm going to start by asking our guest to open her video and unmute. And there we are. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Myra Hurd to PIR live event. Dr. Hurd is a full professor at Queen's University and the project leader with Waste Flow Canada. I'll let her tell you a little bit more about that. I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Hurd, and welcome to all the classrooms.
Hello. Okay, I'm just going to make sure that I can get my PowerPoint up. Yeah,
That's great.
Can everyone see that?
That should be broadcasting. Looks good.
Okay, great. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Myra Hurd, and I'd like to thank Brent for getting all of this organized. So I'm just going to give a short presentation, maybe 10 minutes, something like that, and then I hope that you'll have lots of questions for me about garbage, waste, recycling, and all of those things. So let's just get started. So I am a sociologist by trade, and I've been studying waste issues for about 10 years now, and I'm really fortunate to work with a whole host of really great people. I work with civil engineers, I work with communications scholars, philosophers. We really, we come from a whole lot of different disciplines, and I think that makes the way we study waste better. So I've written a book about the waste problems in Canada. It's called Canada's Waste Flows, and it'll be published soon. And I do work with industry, and I do work with governments. So just recently, just in October, I represented Canada at the G7 meeting on microplastics. So maybe you'll have some questions for me about microplastics. So I went there with the Chief Science Officer of Canada, Dr. Mona Niemer, and we met with the G7 countries, France, Japan, etc., and to talk about microplastics and what Canada, as part of the G7, can do about it. Okay, so here's my presentation. Okay, so I don't know if you guys remember this in the news. Maybe you heard your parents talking about it, maybe in class you talked about it, but back in April, there was a bunch of news stories about this picture here and a whole bunch of other pictures that came out. And this news story was covered by the CBC, the National, Global, etc. And it was talking about 69 shipping containers of waste that were sent from Vancouver in British Columbia to Manila in the Philippines in 2013. And there, these 69 containers of garbage, which had been labeled as recycling, sat there until this year. They rotted, they smelled, they were really, really disgusting. And the Philippines government kept telling the Canadian government to take responsibility and to take this waste back. And of course, no one took responsibility for it. It took all those years, 6 years, for the government, after we were really embarrassed on the international scene. Other countries were talking about, how bad this was, that Canada had done this, this really rich nation, and that we'd sent all this garbage to a developing nation. And so the federal government was really kind of embarrassed into bringing the garbage back. So all those shipping containers were put back on ocean liners, and they were shipped back to Canada. They landed in Montreal. The shipping containers came into Montreal, and then they were transported by trucks across Canada back to Vancouver, where the garbage had to be fumigated and checked, and it was it was incinerated and put into special landfills. Okay, so how can something like this happen? How can it be that diapers from Vancouver end up completely across the globe in shipping containers in the Philippines. Okay, well, let's back up a little bit and have a little bit of a background as to how this happens. Okay, so the first thing we want to know is that Canada is the world's highest municipal solid waste producer. When you see MSW, it stands for municipal solid waste. And this is the waste that is most common to us. You know, that garbage that you put in your garbage and then someone in your house, drags it to the curbside, or they put it in the chute in your apartment building. That's municipal solid waste. And we produce more of this kind of waste than any other country in the world. We produce over 35 million tons of garbage every year. And most of that waste is landfilled. We like to landfill. Why do we like to landfill? Well, we have some amazing civil engineers in Canada who have worked their entire careers to build the safest landfills possible. And we have a lot of land. Unlike countries in Europe who like to incinerate, we have a lot of land. So we like to landfill. The problem, of course, is that a lot of these landfills have already reached capacity, or they're over capacity, or they're going to reach capacity very soon, which means we don't know where to put our garbage. For instance, in Kingston, Ontario, where I teach, our landfill has been closed for quite a number of years now, which means 100% of the waste that Kingstonians produce is getting trucked to other places. Some of it is going to the United States even. So given this kind of crazy way in which we're dealing with our waste, it's kind of interesting that really we haven't paid too much attention to how we got here. And this is what I want to talk about. Why we don't really pay attention to it. Let's check this out. Okay, so this is a table that looks kind of boring, but it's actually really kind of important, because these are statistics that are put out by our federal government, who have collected data from all across Canada for a whole number of years, and they've published where we create the most waste, what kinds of waste. And if you look at this table, you'll see that oil sands tailings, mine tailings, and mine waste rock, which is all about mining, whether it's oil or whether it's minerals, make up by far the biggest source of waste in Canada, by far. That's followed by livestock manure. That's where you get these giant farms who are raising all of the steers, etc., that we're eating. The lowest amount of waste that we produce is municipal solid waste. See that tiny little bar well, for me, it's the right-hand side, with only 34 million tons. Yeah. So what does this mean? Well, most Canadian waste, like in other countries, isn't actually the waste that you and I are producing on a daily basis. Actually, the biggest producers of waste in Canada are industry, and specifically the oil industry and the mining industry, and of course, our military. Our military produces a lot of waste. It's hard to get data on it because the military don't publish data on it. So it's not us. It's not the average every day. It's not you and your family who are creating the most amount of waste in Canada. It's actually industry that's creating the most amount of waste. And often the kind of waste that industry is producing is really toxic, really contaminated waste that has to be dealt with very specially. Yeah? All right. Okay. What does this mean? Well, we can kind of get a handle on why this is. Why, if we're not producing the most amount of waste, and the waste we're producing isn't very toxic compared to what industry is producing, why are we so focused on the waste that we're producing? Why in schools do we talk about how to recycle better? Why at home do we have conversations with our families about what to put in the garbage and what to put in the recycling? Well, the way we can understand this is by thinking about the upstream and the downstream. I've got this little image that I took off the internet, and I don't know how well you can see it, but imagine there's a river, and it flows, as you can see, this river, yeah? Now imagine that there's a community that lives where the downstream word is. Yeah, maybe you see those houses, you see those apartment buildings. Upstream from where all those people are living, where I've put the X, there's an industry. Maybe it's a chemical industry. Maybe it's an industry that makes plastic saran wrap. Maybe it's an industry that makes aluminum foil. It's an industry. And that industry dumps its waste into the river. Now, after some time, the people who are living downstream from this factory notice that people are getting sick. Children are having maybe problems breathing. Maybe pregnant women are having problems with their pregnancy. Maybe people have, they do well. Fantastic nurses and doctors and other healthcare professionals come into the community and they start to treat the people who are getting sick, who are sick. They do their best job they can, but people keep getting sick. And the reason people keep getting sick is because they're treating the problem downstream. They need to treat the problem upstream. So long as that factory is allowed to dump its waste into this river, people are going to continue to get sick. So it means that the solution to the people being ill is to stop this industry from dumping its toxic waste into that river. Yeah, that's the difference between upstream and downstream. Okay. So the upshot is that we deal with waste in Canada in a downstream way. We think of waste really, really downstream, and it's difficult for us to think about how waste is an upstream problem. This is why waste is an upstream problem. In Canada, waste management is privatized. It's not run by the government. It's run by private industry. And the waste management industry makes a huge profit in the billions of dollars every year. It's super, super, super profitable. The companies and corporations that own the waste disposal, whether it's going to go to a landfill or an incinerator, whatever, they also often own the recycling companies. And this means that industries, when they are sending something to being disposed or recycled, they make money off of this, yeah? And the government has left it up to these industries to choose whether they put something in a landfill or whether they recycle it, yeah? And they don't even have to tell us which one of those things they're doing, yeah? So let's look at this waste hierarchy. I feel sure that you are all very, very aware of this one, especially the reduce, reuse, recycle formula. I know my kids at school, when they were in primary school, they even bought, well, I bought t-shirts for them that said reduce, reuse, recycle in that lovely green cycle. But what we notice about this waste hierarchy is that the really best thing we can do is to prevent waste from happening in the first place. Way down at the bottom, the worst thing we're supposed to do is to dispose of that waste. Recycling is kind of, it's better than disposal, according to the waste hierarchy, but it's way worse than prevention, and it's way worse than reuse. Okay, all right. So let's talk about recycling, because recycling is a really good way of finding out why it is that we're in the mess that we're in. Okay. Things only get recycled if there's a profit to be made, which means that often if there isn't a profit to be made, if the cost of plastics is low or aluminum or whatever we ourselves have put in recycling is actually going to go and get landfilled, or it's going to be transported to another country where it's going to be landfilled or openly dumped. Even though we've had recycling for years now, it hasn't reduced the amount of primary stuff that, say, we're mining, etc. Yeah, it hasn't conserved resources at all. Recycling also creates waste, and it often creates highly toxic waste that then has to be disposed of in specially designed landfills. And if you're interested, I can give you some examples. Paper and plastics are a really great example of recycling costing money, and it also creates its own waste. Okay. Studies also show, this is a study that I did with some of my great students, and this study shows that there is a relationship between recycling and consumption. What this complicated graph shows is that if you see that line going up, when neighborhoods and communities have recycling, people increase the amount that they're consuming. And we think the reason that people are consuming more is because they think the materials that they're putting in the recycling are actually being recycled. So they think, well, it's okay for me to buy another flat screen TV. I'm not going to go over all of this, but if you have questions, one of the things that really makes recycling not a great idea in Canada is because we transport a lot of our recycling. Yeah. We don't have the facilities to deal with our recycling on site often. So we're moving recycling stuff all over the globe in order to get those things recycled. And that means that we are using non-renewable fossil fuels. It means we're using trucks, which are emitting carbon dioxide, etc. It increases the amount of microplastics that we're using because tires create microplastics. And we're doing all of this recycling, we're trucking all of our stuff around for things that are maybe going to get one more use out of them. So it's not a very great idea. I'm going to just skip over that. So you guys will be familiar with this kind of thing, becoming a recycling superhero. We get a lot of pressure put on us as people, as families, etc., to recycle without us really knowing the full story of recycling. I like this one here. This is on my own campus at Queen's University. And this really makes you feel kind of bad. And one mistake makes the entire bin garbage. Please sort your recycling properly. And I use this image because it shows that, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves and we put pressure on other people to recycle really well. But it's kind of an empty promise because recycling isn't the answer. Right? And I don't know if you guys know this graphic novel. It's called As the World Burns, 50 Simple Things You Can Do to Stay in Denial. And if you notice, the characters on the front cover are recycling. So all I want to do, this is my last slide, okay? I want to say that with all the problems we have with waste and that we're generating more and more of it, and that this thing we've been promised, like that all we need to do is recycle better and we'll be able to deal with our waste, isn't working. And it doesn't have to be this way. We can think upstream. We can think that our power, our worth isn't as consumers and how we recycle better. It's actually as citizens, right? We can ask our government to regulate industry more, to put more rules in place so that industry has to deal with our waste more responsibly. Yeah. Thank you. I look forward to your questions and to discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Hurd. If you can just click your stop share button at the top of your screen.
Yep. Gotcha.
There we go. Excellent. So I'm going to skip back to an early question from Hayden in Miss Green's class. I'm assuming the question was in regards to the cost of the Filipino issue. So asking, how much did this cost taxpayers?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And I don't think we even have the final tally. It's an excellent question. It cost us well over $1 million. And of course, when we say that the Canadian government took responsibility for it, it really means that taxpayers, so your parents, paid part of the cost for all of this garbage to be sent over there in the first place and then be brought back.
And that obviously doesn't include any of the costs that the Filipino people incurred in having that stored on their shores for 6 years.
Absolutely. And they are trying to get Canadians to pay for that too. And I think they've got a pretty good, strong point.
So another question that goes along with that from Declan and Maya in Shauna Murphy's class, why do we ship waste from Canada to other countries?
Excellent question. We ship waste because it's often cheaper for us, for companies, to ship waste around the globe than it is for those companies to deal with waste in our own country. So for instance, Toronto, as an example, Toronto ships a lot of its waste to Michigan and New York State because it's cheaper for industries to do that than it is to keep the garbage in our own country.
Wow, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like a long way to go to save some money.
Yeah.
Um, Mr. Reventar's class had two early questions that kind of go together. One is, how much more waste can the earth take? And then secondly, how many
Oh,
landfills does
sorry, you
Canada
just.
have?
I'm sorry, you just cut out there for a
Oh,
second. Could you
okay,
repeat the
apologize.
question? I apologize.
So how much more waste can the earth take? And how many landfills does Canada have?
Oh, how much more waste can the earth take? Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, physically, the earth can take a lot more waste than it has right now. But I think maybe a better question is, how many more communities want landfills near them? It's actually getting harder and harder for companies to what they call site landfills. That means build landfills, because no one really wants landfills in their community because they smell, and they can leak, the stuff can leak out, and they can cause health problems, they can cause environmental problems. People don't like having landfills, so companies are finding it harder and harder and harder to get communities to say, yeah, sure, we'll take a landfill near us. So while we have a lot more space on the earth, and Canada has a lot more space, it's really getting hard to keep building more and more landfills. How many landfills do we have in Canada? That is an excellent question, and I am going to say I have no idea. We have thousands of landfills in Canada. We also have quite a number of open dumps, especially in Canada's Arctic. I do research with Inuit in Nunavut, and there are no landfills at all. Everything is openly dumped. So we have thousands of landfills, and we have hundreds of open dumps.
Wow, it's a lot of garbage. Um, So on this same line of questioning, the grade 5 students at Louis Riel in Calgary are asking about other countries and their behavior. Do other countries ship their waste offshore?
Yes, they do. Yes, especially wealthy countries like Canada. So let's take Sweden as an example. I do research in Sweden with researchers who are also studying waste. And Sweden boasts that they have no waste issues at all because they have very high rates of recycling. And Sweden, in fact, imports waste from countries like Germany and Finland and the United Kingdom. And what they do with that waste is they incinerate it. So they burn that waste. And in fact, they don't even necessarily have enough waste. And so they do things like import peat moss from Ireland to keep those incinerators going. But what the story doesn't tell you in Sweden, and this is around the globe, is that all of those waste to energy facilities, incinerators, etc., they are all creating waste, highly toxic waste, and they are all using a lot of energy. So every country has a waste problem.
Obviously. And I mean, the waste from energy from waste question is always an interesting one. Um, Two questions from Miss Green's class, one from Nolan, one from Ella. I'll kind of put these together. One is, what are the toxic chemicals in our rivers from waste? And what can we do to stop industry from dumping?
Excellent questions. Well, there are all kinds. There could be all kinds of dangerous chemicals that leak out into our rivers and our waterways. They can be things like dioxins and furans. They can be all kinds of things. Carbon dioxide. There's loads and loads. There are literally thousands upon thousands of chemicals that can leak out of open dumps, of landfills, and that can get into our water system and can pollute that water system and be a potential danger to us and to the environment, to the plants and animals around us. So what can we do about it? Well, we can do a lot. We can keep talking to our governments at the municipal level, your community level, at the provincial level, and at the federal level to make this a big priority. And the government has the power to get industry to stop creating this kind of waste.
Okay. So again, a government solution. Um, so I'm going to jump ahead to a question that kind of goes along with that. Should we even bother recycling?
You know, that's an excellent question. And I get that kind of question all the time. And here's my answer. First of all, you wanna find out where your recycling goes in your community, because every community is different. Some communities recycle glass, other communities don't. If you put glass in your recycling and it doesn't and it your community can't recycle that glass, there's no point putting it in the recycling, because it's going to get put in disposal, and worse, that glass might break and then it will contaminate the recycling that could get recycled. And so all of that recycling then is going to go into the garbage. So find out in your community, what that could be a class project to find out where your recycling in your community goes. And then you can recycle that material. Recycling, for instance, composting is an excellent idea. This is the big exception to the confusion around recycling. Composting is good because you always want to keep compost material like food out of landfills. It's a really good idea to keep food out of landfills. So compost for sure. Any other material, really take a look at what's going on in your community.
So a number of our students probably live in areas where they have municipal composting programs, but composting always started as a backyard project, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, there's a lot to be said. If you're someone who has a backyard, you can compost in your own backyard. In Europe, in some European countries, they have street composting. So it's a way for the community to get together, and every street or apartment building does its own composting. The great advantage of that is that there's not a truck coming down your street leaking microplastics from its tires, discharging carbon dioxide and increasing, global warming, and taking it somewhere that maybe is going to have to be taken even further away, maybe hundreds of kilometers away, to a composting facility. The more we can do things locally, the better it is for the climate.
Excellent. Another interesting question, and there's a couple about industry, obviously, because you've identified them as the major provider of pollutants and garbage. How can industries recycle, reduce, reuse waste? Can they implement mechanisms like catalytic conversion to trap gas fumes, etc.?
Yes, they can, and some waste management industries do that, and some industries are being more progressive than others in how they deal with their waste. Let's keep in mind something though. Most of the waste that industries are producing is when they're making an object. This creates far more waste than when we consume an object and dispose of it. So most waste is actually produced pre-consumption. If you take an object, like I have this pen here, most of the waste that this pen creates isn't when I put it in the garbage, or I don't know, try to pick it apart and put it in the recycling. It's actually when this pen was being made that created the most waste. That's where industry needs to start. They need to take responsibility for all of the waste that they create when they're creating things that we then buy.
So there are a few more questions about energy from waste. Should Canada be looking at energy from waste? Is that a better solution?
That is another excellent question. Well, in fact, some places do use waste to energy facilities like Metro Vancouver. We don't have many of them in Canada. There's one outside of Toronto. There are a few scattered across. There's only around 7 scattered across Canada. Again, as I mentioned, Canadians aren't too thrilled with waste to energy facilities. They create waste. They create this thing called bottom ash, and they create fly ash. And fly ash contains some of the most toxic materials that humans have ever made. So they have to be managed and regulated extremely well. So it's not that, so it depends what you think is better and what you think is worth. Both of them are downstream responses. Both of them are about the issue once it's being created. We got to remember that, right? It's not dealing with waste upstream, it's dealing with waste downstream.
So I just wanted to, we got a load of questions. So if you've got time, we're going to try and get
I
through it.
have time.
That's fabulous. So there's a few questions asking about, I'll call it from Mr. Hergott's class, the myth of recycling. So why does the myth of recycling continue? What is in it for municipalities? Why do they continue to do this if there's so many challenges with recycling?
Oh, what a fantastic question. I would like my undergraduate students at my university to ask that kind of fantastic high level question. Well, yeah, recycling is a lot more complicated than we've been led to believe. And we've been led to believe that recycling is so good because industry has put a lot of money into educational programs that are run by municipalities to teach us that recycling is great. So it's actually the recycling and waste management companies who fund municipalities to teach us that recycling is great. Why? Well, because they profit from it, they make money from it, and it takes our attention away from the fact that they're the ones who are creating the most waste. It's been super successful. In the United States, more people recycle than vote. Recycling is super popular. It's a great way for people to show that they care about the planet, that they want to do something good, but it's not doing what people think it's doing.
So it's interesting. When you brought that up earlier, I did make a note to myself that garbage management is a vertically integrated industry. So anybody who's in a classroom thinking about businesses, if you can make the materials that you need to keep your secondary business going, that's a great business model. Mm-hmm. So if you make waste and then you can run a company that manages that, that's a great business model. Maybe not good for the environment.
Mm-hmm. And there are some really major corporations across Canada, like Waste Management Incorporated, who they own the entire system. You know, they own the landfills, they own the trucks, they're so wealthy that they can undercut other companies when they're making contracts with municipalities.
So two early questions that I wanted to jump back to. This is one that comes up every now and then. So Ivan's asked about sending our garbage to space.
Ah, well, there's already a lot of garbage in space. I don't know if you guys watch Futurama. Maybe I'm dating myself, but there's a whole episode of Futurama dedicated to this idea where they've actually, New York City used to have a waste problem, and so they created this giant ball of waste and they put it out into space. And the episode is they've got a problem because that ball of waste has circled around and it's coming back and it's going to hit the earth and destroy the earth. So if you're interested, go and see that, go watch that Futurama episode. We've already got loads of waste in space. We've got, you name it, it's up there. All of the things that we've sent up into space, most of it stays there. We haven't brought it back, and so we've already got a lot of garbage out there. Do we want to send even more garbage into space? Well, first of all, we don't have the technology to take our waste, all of our, polystyrene from our flat screen TVs and all of that. And it would just be so cost prohibitive to put all of that waste into space. We shouldn't have to put waste into space. We should be able to deal with it ourselves.
Excellent. You mentioned microplastics earlier. There was a question about what are microplastics?
Oh, excellent question. Okay, so microplastics, they almost always come from, not always, but mostly they come from bigger plastics. We have like my pen, is mostly made out of plastic. Microplastics are plastics that are 5 centimeters 5 millimeters or less in in size. And so you can even get nanoplastics, which you can't even see with your eye. So we have microplastics in our oceans, in our lakes. You might have seen that, some tea bags use microplastics. Personal care products. If you ever get personal care products like body wash, and it has those little grains, those grains are often made out of microplastics. And so when we wash our bodies, all those microplastics go down the drain and they go into our liquid waste stream. So the thing about microplastics is we know we have a lot of them. We don't have the data yet to know what their real impacts are. We have some data. We need to do a lot more research to find out what the impacts are.
There's a question in the Q&A about government policy related to supermarkets donating, giving away food, donating to shelters. Does that help the problem at all?
Well, I have a really fantastic colleague. Her name is Dr. Elaine Power, and she works in health studies. And her argument, I think, is a pretty persuasive one. She says that, again, that's a very downstream response, that, wealthy people, there's way too much food available, way too much food is being produced. And then when grocery stores, etc., can't sell, this food to the people that can afford it, they give it to to low income people. And the problem with that, of course, is that we're asking people to be grateful for eating our garbage. And that's a kind of iffy ethical thing to do, isn't it? It would be far better if we could have some real conversations as Canadians about why it is we have so much stuff in our grocery stores. Why do grocery stores dump so much of their food? Why are we consuming more food than we need? Why do we buy so much food and then throw it out ourselves? These are the upstream questions that we need to really be figuring out, rather than saying, well, we'll just give food to low income people and they should be really grateful to be getting our casts off, our waste.
Yeah, I've heard that argument as well, and it's a challenging one. I'm going to try to capture a bunch of questions in one, because we are about 10 minutes over already, and I want to respect everybody's time. There are a number of questions that are dealing with the future of waste management, government policy, what can be done, is it different garbage management, is it reduction? What is it that we can look to our governments to help us with to reduce this problem?
Mm. Well, it really is government's responsibility, right? Consumers, ordinary people, are doing a lot in terms of managing their own household waste. It really is time for government to step up, and government can do a whole lot of things. Government can work at that upstream level. They can introduce regulations. They can change the conversation. They can ban certain plastics. They can regulate the way in which industry produces objects and the way they manage those objects. They can make, for instance, people might have heard of extended producer responsibility. Government can make industries responsible for all of the packaging that we get when we buy things. Many people don't like all of this packaging. And what industry does is when they say that they're paying, that they'll take all of that recycling, they're just transferring the cost back to consumers and making the products more expensive, right? So government really, really has the power to set limits on what industry does, and to really make it known that industry will get rewarded for reducing the amount of waste that they're creating, and to figure out how we can move up in our priorities: reduction, reuse, and refurbishment.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much for that answer, and to all of your other answers and your presentation today. We're going to need to stop here because we're well over time already. Thank you to all the classrooms that joined us today. We have 24 classrooms still on this, even though we are over time. Thank you very much, Dr. Hurd.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your questions and keep thinking about garbage.
Fabulous. And thank you to all the classrooms. Teachers, pay attention to promotion for future live events. We are starting a series on junior astronaut program with the CSA. So that information is going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks. Thank you very much and enjoy your day.